As we do this spiritual adventure, looking at wisdom, one of the questions wisdom tries to answer for us is why? If you've had a toddler run around your house for any length of time, you know one of the first questions they ask is why? Why? And it's not because toddlers are born or grow into this natural tendency towards philosophy. It's because they have discovered a very easy to pronounce word that will evoke a response from adults, and they just like the sound of and the process of that engaging. So all the questions and why? But that habit that begins when you're a toddler never really ends when you're an adult, and throughout life we often ask the question, why? And we are not satisfied unless we have an answer to the question, why? And wisdom, although it's not going to give us a definitive answer for every scenario, it builds for us a perspective, a framework, so we can better understand the why, although we will not necessarily fully understand it, but it gives us a background or a perspective to at least contextualize that question. And as Solomon writes the book of Ecclesiastes, and in our journals, you are going to see there are 3 or 4 sections that are in Ecclesiastes, because normally when we talk about wisdom, we go into the book of Proverbs, but Ecclesiastes has a lot to say about the life skill of wisdom, and I love the book of Ecclesiastes, one of my favorites. So that's why it's there. By the way, another little quick sidebar. If you've gone through and added up how many sections there are in your spiritual journal, you'll discover there are 8 texts that eight sections to it, and we've only got 7 Sundays. The reason for that is when we did the series in Acts, I decided to add one more Sunday in Acts and take one away from this series because we still had to end on Easter. So there's going to be one of those little texts that you copy out that are not going to be included, and it's Proverbs chapter 1. So go ahead and continue to copy that out because obviously there's great value in that, but I'm going to skip the Proverbs 1 text and go to the following one in our time together here. And there are extra copies of the journal back there on that table. It's also in the emails that you get on Friday and Sunday. There's a link to click, and you can download your own copy of it if you want to do it that way. But in the book of Ecclesiastes then, one of the opening questions that Solomon has is why. And I think it would be good for us to read through Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and to just get a sense of how he frames this question. Now in Ecclesiastes, if you were to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to read through this book and I'm going to do my devotions out of this book, it won't take very long for you to get bogged down and kind of feel like, oh, this is a depressing book. And that's the whole point. The very style in which it's written, the images that Solomon uses are intended to reflect the chaos and the confusion that marks life on a day-to-day basis, and the injustices that we experience, and the questions that remain unanswered. So the very style that Ecclesiastes is written in is a reflection of the struggle and the complications of everyday life. And yet within that there is structure and there's order in the way that Solomon has put his material together, and it comes to a beautiful end at the very end of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12, where he says, and the end of the matter is this, to fear God and obey his commandments. And yet he takes this very serpentine process through the world of words to get us to that point. So we're going to spend a couple of weeks here in the book of Ecclesiastes. But let me read from chapter 1. We'll just read the first, we'll read the whole chapter, 18 verses, to help us put the question out there. We have to understand the question before we can find an answer. Ecclesiastes 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Isn't that encouraging? Second verse, and it's like everything is horrible. What does man gain by all the toil which he toils under the sun? And this is the big question. What's the point of it all? Why? To put it into toddler language. What's the point? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and it goes to the north, and around goes the wind. And on its circuits, the wind returns. What's the point? All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, "See, this is new"? It's already been in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of the former things. The good old days are gone. Who remembers them? Nor will there be remembrance of latter things to be among those who come after. Are you not encouraged? Isn't that great? I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. There's a great life verse. What's your life verse? It's an unhappy business that God has given me. That comes from Eeyore chapter 3, verse 7. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, that I perceive that is also a striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. What an encouraging text of Scripture. But what Solomon is trying to do, we have to look at this in terms of the entire book of Ecclesiastes. He is asking the foundational question of wisdom. What's the point? Who cares? Or as a toddler would say, why? Purposelessness is a horrible thing to have present in our life. And this is what Solomon is illustrating as he talks about the natural cycles of God's created order, the endless repetition of the sun rising and setting, of the streams flowing and the oceans never being filled, of the wind blowing around the earth and coming back to its same place, to be able to perceive and know things that previously were unknown, and yet it doesn't answer the ultimate question. To be wounded by the pursuit of answers, and yet never accomplish those answers. That purposelessness drives us crazy, and it dries the soul, and it stagnates the mind. And we say, what's the point? Why? And the way Solomon has written this text is intended to help us, one, resonate with the problem that he has identified, and two, in our own hearts and minds, take up this burden and begin the investigation to finding a satisfying answer. How can this be if this is the life that God has created? It's a dreary perspective on life, because life can be dreary. If we think that simply because we're people of faith, somehow we are going to surf on the top of the waves of life's crises and live with joy, 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 and happiness, 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 and prosperity, 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 then we are sorely deceived, because that's not the reality. Even for people of faith, there are highs and there are lows. And there are those who in the moment of any given moment of time are drowning in the troughs of an overwhelming storm of life, and they're saying, God, save me. And it seems like he does not hear, he does not care. Where is God? I'm done with this. I'm giving up. And we've all been there. We've all grieved. We've all suffered that sense of loss. And we've all asked the question, why? What's the point? And wisdom is not about finding a new algorithm or a new set of rules or a new strategy or a new philosophy of ministry that says, here's the secret for life. Wisdom says we need to change our perspective and definition of purpose so we can see the Creator even when we're going down for the last time and that huge crest of a wave is coming over us and we have no idea if we're even going to survive. And Solomon's writing in chapter 1, the dreariness of this, the heaviness of this is life. And yet there's hope. Because Solomon, we do get to it at the end of chapter 12, and it sounds kind of trite. Fear God. Woo, okay, yeah, be better than I am. That's a great solution. Thanks, Graham. I already feel guilty. I don't need that added to me too. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying be perfect. He's not saying pick yourself up and carry on. He is talking about, though, understanding the dynamics of life in God's created order. We can very easily reduce this, inappropriately reduce this with cliches like, you just have to be more godly. You just have to be more Christ-like. You need to let go and let God. A person of faith, any cliche like that is inherently inaccurate and a misrepresentation of God. The prophet Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet because he's struggled, I think, from all that we could see in his writings, he struggled with depression and with being overwhelmed in light of and because of his relationship with God. And he saw the holiness of God and the faithfulness of God and the righteousness of God. And then he saw the condition of the people around him, and he was depressed, and they threw him into a pit, and they abused him, and his life was horrible. And he wept, and he wept, and he wept, and he'd be one of those guys that I'd be saying, Jeremiah, listen, I love you, man. Thanks for your faithfulness. But you're a downer, and I can only spend a couple hours with you a week because you're pulling me down. Habakkuk, God, how can this possibly be? Look at all of this injustice around us. How can you allow this to happen, God? And God says, oh, you talking to me? Okay, I'll tell you. I'm going to show you something you're not going to believe. I'm going to take this nation of pagans, and I'm going to have them come, and they're going to run roughshod over my chosen people and destroy them. And people are going to suffer and go into captivity. And it's going to be like nothing that you can possibly imagine. And Habakkuk struggles with that until at the very end of his book, he says, even though there's no harvest in the field, even though there's no cattle in the barn, I will praise my God. Because his perspective was something different than just having to understand the why. He never got the why. But he did have something else. So the big question in verses 2 and 3 of Ecclesiastes 1 is this. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Kind of get the impression this word vanity is kind of important. What does man gain by all the toil which he toils under the sun? The idea that the word's translated vanity, the language here, it's a word picture, it's a metaphor. And it talks about breath or smoke or fog, which if we were, and I thought about bringing in a candle and blowing it out, but if you have something that is a little dispersion of smoke or of fog, and you see it for a moment and it exists, then it disappears, where did it go? Life is like that. That it just seems like despite the effort you put into it, you can work really, really hard at something, and the effort, the reward for that is very short-lived. And in fact, in some environments, you can work really, really hard for something for your boss, and then somebody swoops in and takes the credit, and the boss goes, "Hey, great job, Peggy," and slaps them on the back, gives them the bonus, and you're like, that's not fair. No, it's not, and that's life. And we're not stoic about it, that, well, we just got to suffer. We have to have an understanding of God's created order. And what Solomon is trying to do in chapter 1 is to introduce his students, his readers, to a new way of thinking about God's created order. All that God has made, being still under his authority, and yet now contaminated and broken by the reality of sin. So Psalm 8 says, "The earth is the Lord's and all it contains," and that has not changed. In the book of Deuteronomy, as we saw last week, chapter 4 at the very end, it says, "God is the creator of heaven above and earth below." Who is like our God? There is no other. So based on these assumptions about the nature of God's created order, Solomon is pulling out this very uncomfortable reality, but yes, it is broken. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. What's the point? It's useless. What does man gain by all of his hard work, which he works under the sun? And there's the key phrase that we see repeated 26 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. What's the point of life under the sun? And in a very subtle way, without explaining it, without going into great detail like the Apostle Paul would, Solomon introduces this phrase of life under the sun. Again, it's a word picture. And what Solomon is saying is if we look at God's created order, and we look all around and we see the beauty of the creation, all we will see are streams that run to the ocean and the water evaporating, going back up to the mountains and falling into the streams and repeating over and over and over again. All we will see is the wind going around the world over and over again. All we will see are generations of people who are born, who live, who die, and they never remember the people who came before them. If we look at God's created order from under the sun, that is from purely the material perspective. But if we look at life from above the sun, we see something totally different. And this is where Solomon is going in the book of Ecclesiastes. He doesn't get there in chapter 1, but it is introduced in the rest of the book that life is about life above the sun. That we have a perspective that this is my Father's world. And although there is chaos and confusion, and what's the point? What's the purpose? This is confusing and even hurtful. And I feel all kinds of things. I struggle with my self-esteem. I struggle with shame. I struggle with feeling valueless. I struggle with, and the list is endless. All people of all time in all places have struggled with these things. If we live under the sun, there's dissatisfaction at every corner, dissatisfaction with the endless natural cycle of life that seems purposeless. There's dissatisfaction with the same old, and even the greatest contributions we can make can be misunderstood or forgotten. And you sometimes scratch your head. There's some evidence of this even in our contemporary culture, where monuments have been raised to people that were once figured as historic heroes that are now being destroyed, rightly or wrongly. They are now being taken down and destroyed. Stadiums are built, and they are named for people who managed the financing or had some significant contribution, only for a corporation to come along and buy the rights and stick their name on it. Anybody remember Skydome? Now the Rogers Center, right? People remember, and then they forget, and then of what value is it? Walk around a cemetery, and you got to wonder, what was this man, this woman's, this person's contribution to life? You haven't got a clue. Not a clue. The dissatisfaction of that. And then the dissatisfaction with being dissatisfied all the time. This is the problem. Why is it the problem? Because we were created to have purpose and to have value. And the brokenness of the world, the sin that was introduced by Adam and Eve, robs us of understanding what purpose and value is in the realm of God's created order. And like Solomon, and he goes on in chapters 2 and chapters 3 and talks about, I pursued this and I tried that and I went after all kinds of attempts to bring solace and satisfaction to my soul, and none of it was satisfactory. None of it worked, because we were made to have purpose and to have value only. Let me rephrase that. We were made to have purpose and to have value in God's created order, being made in His image. That's what it means. But because of sin, we can only understand and have that need satisfied, which is a legitimate need with which God has created us, if we live life from above the sun and not under the sun. Purposelessness is exhausting. Verses 12 to 14, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven, life under the sun. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Just to try and survive the rat race day after day after day will never satisfy. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and it is a striving. It all is vanity and a striving after the wind. So what is Solomon's point here? The cycle of life is unchanged. The Gutenberg press introduced new abilities and facilitated new ideas, but it didn't solve all the problems. The Industrial Revolution has introduced new abilities and facilitated new ideas, but it didn't solve the problems. The Technological Revolution introduced new abilities and facilitated new ideas. It didn't solve the problems. The Information Age has introduced new abilities and facilitated new ideas. It hasn't solved the problem. Artificial intelligence will introduce new abilities and facilitate new ideas. It hasn't solved the problem. What is the point? And the point is that the solution, the context, the understanding, authentic wisdom, the skill of living life well, representing Christ well, in a broken environment, that's what wisdom is found above the sun and not under the sun. And the wisdom skill to find that fulfillment for purpose, so we are not living purposelessly and with that dissatisfaction, even though, because we live in a sin-saturated world and we are broken people ourselves, as the Apostle Paul said in Romans 7, the things I want to do, I don't do. Things I don't want to do, I do. Oh, wretched man that I am. And we are in this process of being transformed by the grace of God. We can still have a perspective and an understanding of life in God's created order that is above the sun and gives us that hope and that sense of purpose that even though the waves are crashing around us and we might drown, maybe God is best glorified by us being overwhelmed. This is what confuses us, because everything else in our society and culture says, no, don't be a victim to that. And I'm not trying to mock that idea of being a victim. It's a real thing. I understand that. But at the same time, we have to understand that if God is God, and He is, then the events that happen to us, especially the ones that are not by our choice, but even the ones that are not beyond His realm of authority and ability to redeem. And the Apostle Paul, who was a persecutor and a murderer of early church followers of Jesus, became its greatest leader in the first century by God's grace. And we are not held prisoner by these things. And yet it's not easy, because everything in our environment and apart from the work of the Spirit of God within us says we are overwhelmed by this and there is no other alternative. So what is the wisdom skill? What is the thing we learn that moves us from purposelessness to understanding and embracing and having that contentment, that satisfaction that this text, as Solomon has written it, cries to have that dryness of the soul satisfied. Well, the root of the problem is that we don't understand God's created order. We don't see life from above the sun, because that is a perspective, as the author of Hebrews says, that is won by faith and not by sight. The futility of life can only be answered by an understanding of faith in a God that's greater than the life. Purpose can never be found within something itself. For an object to have purpose, that purpose is conveyed or placed upon that object by the Creator. That's true about anything. This stand did not just suddenly become a stand and have purpose. It is the result of several people probably putting their heads together and figuring out all the logistics of design and manufacturing to create this thing. The purpose for this thing is found from outside, not from within. And we are the same as God's created beings, that we find purpose in life outside the sun. So the skill, or from above the sun, the skill is learning the perspective of life above the sun. And it is a challenging skill because it goes against everything in the messaging of our society and our culture, and even of ourselves and our sin nature. It is something the Spirit of God has to do within us. And we cannot force it. We cannot generate it. It is something that is learned often through the process of living the reality of Ecclesiastes 1, that there's something that's greater than this. What is it? What's the point? A wise person learns the skill of perspective as life only makes sense from an above-the-sun perspective. Wisdom tells us the answer to our questions will not be found in expanding the range of our accumulated data or within the system itself, but it will be found by learning to trust in a God who loves us. And I know that sounds glib, and I criticized that at the beginning of my message, but it is the bottom line to understanding the truths that are especially portrayed for us in the New Testament of the Apostle Paul, and who this God is in the first couple of chapters of Ephesians and of Colossians, and understanding his engagement to redeem us and the nature of his authority in the person of Christ. And as we process that and we begin to see life from an above-the-sun perspective, then we can build a context for all the chaos around us. Not to make us immune. We can never accomplish a state of being that all of a sudden we're bulletproof and this stuff never affects us. That's not wisdom. Wisdom says that when we're going down for the last time, we still have confidence in a living God. And all of this is based out of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 4, not the verses we looked at last week, but another section of Deuteronomy 4 that helps us understand who is this God. Chapter 4, verse 5. See, I have taught you, this is Moses talking to the generation of Israelites that are going to leave the wilderness and go into the promised land. See, I have taught you the statutes and the rules as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to possess it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. They're skilled at life. Why? Because Moses said, these rules are not just rules. This isn't just a regimen you follow. This isn't like a spiritual training plan that you do 5 spiritual, what are those floppy things you go down and, I don't know, I never do them. But it's not doing push-ups or jumping jacks spiritually. It's not even going out for a run spiritually. It's learning beyond rules and regimen the nature of the Creator God. What God gave Israel in the Old Testament law was not how to be saved, but this is my heart, this is my character, this is my love for you, and because of sin, this is how you resolve the sin problem so we can have relationship with one another. As we sang earlier, Emmanuel, God dwelling with us. And then I love verse 7. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us? And that word near, it's a beautiful word picture of proximity, that the gods aren't up there far away, disconnected, but of intimacy, of God walking with his people, dwelling with his people. And what other nation has a God who has demonstrated himself to be near to us as our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And in those moments when we are overwhelmed and we just cry out, we know, even though we may not feel, it's not based on how we perceive or feel, but we know that our God is near us. This is life above the sun. This is the life skill, wisdom of learning to discipline our hearts and minds to the truth that God is with us. He is always near, regardless of our circumstances. And although it may feel this way, this is the truth, that we are living life above the sun, even though we are plagued by the problems under the sun. So this skill is learned by focusing on the reality of the presence of God. And it's not a mystical sense that I enter into another state and become aware of him as an energy presence, but a relational understanding that he is my God and we are his people. And prayer is one of the means that we use to refocus that perspective. Because prayer is that language of confession where we confess our submission to God. God, this doesn't make sense, but I'm submitting myself to your authority because I trust in your goodness and your grace and your faithfulness. We confess our dependence on God. And God, I can't fix this. Now, maybe there are things that I can do, and there are always things for which I can take responsibility, but ultimately, even that is dependent on the Spirit of God working within me to change me. And maybe my circumstances won't change, but I'm dependent on you. And God, I want to confess my loyalty to you and to your kingdom, because you are the Creator God. This skill of learning perspective above the sun helps us understand what things are true, what things are real, and what things have value. And if we begin to see life through that grid, through that perspective, then some of the chaos, not all, there's always a struggle, but some of it is sifted out. And we are able to see a greater reality of God's care for us and be assured of that. The skill of perspective helps us distinguish, and Solomon's going to talk about this at length, between that which is eternal and that is temporal. Because ultimately it is the eternal that matters. And the skill of perspective, that life is lived above the sun, teaches us that the struggle is real and that's okay. The cycle seems endless, but it's not. God's grace will always be there for us. Yet, it is a skill we learn. And just like these four icons we have here, the potter, the carpenter, the artist, the mason, all of these tradespeople and artists learn their skill over time with much practice and much failure. And you cut a board that's not square and you got to start over again, or you build something and the wall falls over, or you paint a picture of a beautiful flower and somebody says, I love the moose that you painted. And you realize you need to literally go back to the drawing board. These, we do not expect when somebody says, I'm going to be a potter, that the very first thing they produce is going to be accepted by Buckingham Palace as the official source of pottery for the United Kingdom. We understand there's a time, a process of learning these skills. Wisdom is like this, that we learn over time, sometimes including failure, but that failure never limits God. Who failed greater than the Apostle Paul, who went and executed faithful followers of Jesus, and then later had to go into those same churches and look at the widows and the children of the men he had killed and preach the gospel to them? This is what God does for us. But through the process of learning the life skill of living from above the sun. That God is creator of heaven and earth. The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, including its affliction, including its confusion, including its chaos. And the futility is only futility, and the vanity is only vanity if we do not see life from above the sun. So wisdom, the skill of wisdom says, I need to learn, because of who God is, that I can live above the sun and not be dictated by the currents and the conditions and the cycles of life under the sun. But even though I'm affected by that and I live in that reality, I have a hope that is greater than that, because I have a relationship with the God who created all that exists, including the sun. And this creator God desires to dwell in relationship with us.